hello. Welcome, everyone. It's so nice to see faces. If you'd like to show your face, you're welcome to. We'll have the speakers spotlighted. And if you'd like, please put your name, where you're calling from in the chat, as well as your LinkedIn. If you'd like to connect with people on this call, we always love to encourage and support connections across the CHIPS community. I'm Monica Phillips. I'm the Director of Learning Content and DEI at CHIPS. And it is such a great pleasure to be here with really the leaders in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging from across the entire legal industry. We have here with us today Cheryl Garko, who's a partner at rhetoric, Malika Lindo, who's Senior Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Morgan Lewis, Stacy Collier, Chief Talent Officer at Nixon Peabody, Caren Ulrich Stacy, the CEO of Diversity Lab, and Manya Bunch, who is the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at WilmerHale. This started with the CHIPS Honor Roll, and these four women represent the CHIPS Honor Roll firms, and Caren is our partner at Diversity Lab. The CHIPS Honor Roll is a joint initiative between CHIPS and the Diversity Lab. Selections are based on findings from Diversity Lab's Inclusion Blueprint, which provides diversity benchmarks of historically underrepresented groups: female lawyers, underrepresented racial, ethnic lawyers, LGBTQ+ lawyers, and lawyers with disabilities in law firm leadership and across practice groups, including IP. And these are the people whose firms really outshine everyone in that list. And so we want to take this opportunity to come together, especially at this time where we've seen so much change in the DEIB landscape, starting with the Supreme Court striking down affirmative action in college admissions and then leading to some lawsuits. So here today, we are going to really take a look at how these firms reacted to that anti-DEI rhetoric and what they're doing and how they're interacting with clients in their legal departments. So to start, I will turn it over to Caren Ulrich Stacy. Welcome, Caren.
Hi, thanks, Monica. So I will not take up a lot of time on what's happened since the Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action, because I think you've read the news. So you probably have a pretty good lay of the land. But what I'm most excited about today is that, there's a lot of discussion about the negativity around DEI and folks, activists, lawsuits, and the like, who are pushing against having a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable workforce. But we have with us today 4 firms who are not going to let that momentum stop. And not only have they taken efforts and done a lot of work pre-SCOTUS ruling, they've, I would say, even doubled down on creating more inclusive and equitable workforces. Because I think we've all, the silver lining is that we're all emboldened a little bit on the side of the House to make sure that the progress that we've all made together doesn't backtrack or backslide. So just quickly, before we get into what these firms are doing, backing up a bit, Monica, on the Inclusion Blueprint, I thought it would be helpful just to get some background on what the Inclusion Blueprint is and why these firms, the 4 of them, scored higher than the 300+ firms that participated in the last round. So back in 2018, which feels like such a long time ago, CHIPS called and said, we've been doing a survey of our law firms for a very long time. We asked them about the demographics of their diversity, but we're not seeing progress in the degree or to the degree we'd like to. And we realized there's a bunch of other organizations already asking for diversity demographics. What could we do different and better in an effort to push progress on inclusivity, right? We're not just thinking about diversity and representation of diversity, but what could we do to push for inclusion and equity in the firm's processes and procedures? And so we set out to define what are inclusive processes that law firms and even legal departments could undertake at the firm-wide level, but also at the practice group level. Because as everyone's shaking their heads, Malika and I have talked about this a lot, the rubber meets the road in the practice group, right? So Cheryl and Stacy as partners in their practice groups, they're deciding daily who gets access to great work, who gets regular and direct access to any individual client, what happens on pitch teams, who gets quote unquote credit for bringing in work. And so it was really important to us at Diversity Lab to think about it firm-wide. Pay equity is something, for instance, that's an inclusive process or practice that you can do on the firm-wide side. But thinking about work allocation, thinking about sponsorship, that's something you can do as an inclusive process to measure whether that's happening equitably at the practice group level. So when we surveyed 300 plus firms, we found a lot of good, positive, thoughtful practices going on in firms to create more inclusive workplaces. We also found some areas where firms were lacking. So I'll mention those just briefly. On the firm-wide side, I mentioned pay equity. That is one where firms tend to lack that as an inclusive process. So a very few percentage of firms do pay equity studies of their partners and associates every 5 years. And that's something at Diversity Lab, when we correlate more diverse populations with inclusive processes, one of the things we find is those firms that keep and retain, especially their partners, tend to do things like pay equity studies. And not only do they do the study, they remedy whatever issues they find, if any. The other not bright spot that we found that folks are working on, including the 4 firms that have joined us today, is there hasn't been as much of a focus on lawyers with disabilities. And so we're glad to see that firms are taking a much more thoughtful and intentional approach. In fact, 90 firms are working with us at Diversity Lab to create a more inclusive environment for lawyers with disabilities. So lastly, IP, because I know, with CHIP's connectivity to the patent and intellectual property and trademark and policy side of the world, we very specifically wanted to look at what was happening in the IP practice groups and practice groups as a whole, but in IP. And some of the things we found was IP is actually much more diverse and inclusive than folks want to make it out to be. Typically we like to lead with things like IP is less diverse than, for instance, labor and employment. Still true. But they're not quite the underdog that everyone has made IP out to be. And in fact, when you look at these 4 firms that have joined us today, not only are they above average in terms of diversity representation in IP, they've made more progress, and our field has made more progress in diversifying our IP practice groups than a lot of our other practice groups. So there's some intentionality going on here. And I know it's probably in large part with the partnership with CHIPS, because all the firms that are on and all the legal departments that are on have partnered with CHIPS, and CHIPS has made this a really important focus. But 3 things we're seeing practice groups not do as well, including IP. One is not tracking and making sure that non-billable work is equitably distributed. So one of the things we found is that when you think about this in a legal department setting or in a law firm setting, and we actually have data to support this in the law firm setting, oftentimes our women are doing double the amount and sometimes triple the amount of what Joan Williams and others calls housework. So things that in law firms, you can't bill your time for. And we all know, right, the economics of a law firm are if you can bill for it, brings money in, and that often translates to who gets advanced, and that also translates to what that person's compensation looks like. Similarly, on the legal department side, right, we see, when people are tasked with things that move the legal department and the company forward, sometimes it's internal facing work that feels like housework as opposed to the strategic work that they could be doing to be visible with their business partners. The second and the third things I'll mention briefly. One is direct and irregular access to clients on the law firm side. So tracking and to make sure that in our IP practices, our lawyers have direct access. And then the last is business generation. So if we're trying to advance our associates and keep our partners, and in particular, make sure that it's an equitable environment, focusing on who's bringing in business, who has access to business, and who's quote unquote getting credit for that business is something that we're not tracking in the same way that we could be if we wanted to make a great impact. So those are some of the areas that we could work on, but I'm glad to say that Morgan Lewis, Nixon, Wilmer Hale, and Ulrich are bright spots in all of these areas. So where firms sometimes are lacking in what I've talked about, these firms have done all, if not or most, if not all of the things that we're talking about today. So I really do want to hand it back to Monica and to these firms to talk about what they're doing post SFFA, but also on some of these things that we know are going to drive our profession forward and continue the momentum that we've had. So Monica, I'll turn it back to you.
Caren, it sounds like you just made the business case for Y chips. So thank you for that. That is what we're all about, right? Is taking action, helping women identify where they can be showing up to get that billable work, and then also building the relationships, getting access to the clients, creating your network. So excellent. And I think it's, I mean, I don't know if we can take credit for that, but when you walk into the Global Summit with 800 women, it feels just incredible, right? And we have Kathy Vidal leading the USPTO, and we see these incredible examples of women leading across innovation and inventorship, and it's just extraordinary. So I really appreciate all the women who have come up to make IP really accessible and to create that pathway for women leading in this practice. So I'm really glad to have all of you here. Stacy, I would love to hear a little bit more about the awareness that you're building at Nixon Peabody around what happened in the wake of the Supreme Court decision and the DEI, anti-DEI rhetoric.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think the first thing was we weren't quiet about it. So the decision came out and immediately our managing partner, came forward with a statement. And I know that there's a lot of back and forth about statements on social and political and other issues. And, different folks have different views about whether we should do them, whether you can ever make everybody happy or even 51% of people happy with statements. But I do think it was helpful in this particular case because, we had a segment of our population that was very concerned, very scared, and wanted to understand what the firm's response was going to be in the wake of the decision, right? And whether this was going to be a doubling down, as Caren said, or whether we were going to temper all the good things that we were doing. And so I think that was the first thing, and it got people talking, and it got us thinking about how we were going to not react to the Supreme Court decision, but how we were going to manage our business on a day-to-day basis and move forward with the very important things that we were doing in the DEI space. In a way, obviously, that was appropriate and thoughtful, but that's always been the way we've tried to look at it, an appropriate and thoughtful way in which we approach all of our strategic initiatives, of which DEI is an enormous one.
Yeah, thank you. Manya, would you like to add to that? What Wilmer's doing?
Sure. I echo everything that was said, and also just point out we didn't start our conversation when the decision came out. I'm sure Malika would agree. Particularly in the DEI space, we sort of expected what was coming down, so there had been just communication around that. Before that, we also have an anti-discrimination practice where we advise clients regularly on these type of issues. So there'd always been a lot of conversation around what our DEI programs were, how we structure our programs. We work with our GC, what's the lawfulness of our program. So when the decision came down, it took the air out of our sails a little bit, just because even if we expected it. But in terms of sort of pivoting and having to do something different, we didn't have to, that wasn't a starting point for us. We, just did an audit of our programs, talked to some of our partners, talked to some of our clients, had internal communications, because if you're not involved in DEI, I think there was just this fear of the DEI boogeyman. A lot of people don't have a concept of what we do. So just reiterating to internal stakeholders that we have always had lawful employment and hiring and promotion processes, and we will continue to do that. So I think it was a campaign internally, just reinforcing and reiterating what we were doing. And I think one of the things that came out of it too was it wasn't just DEI. We were sort of, we were partnering with everyone. So we were presenting with our GCs, to our marketing teams, to our business development teams, just reassuring everyone internally. But it was more just continuing to keep our ear to the ground, but pivoting and informing people what DEI was and how we were moving forward.
What are some of the things that came up when you say you keeping your ear to the ground? Did you hear things that you had to address in the moment?
Just, I think, again, speaking to the sort of, I call it the DEI boogeyman, that, if you are involved in DEI, you know that DEI is not, it's not centered around a particular group of people, or it's not centered around a particular goal. When you're talking about DEI, you're talking about systems inside of organizations, and you're talking about creating processes that mitigate biases in systems. So as Caren talked about, what your assignment processes look like, what intentionality you have around making sure that there's equitable exposure to clients and to development. So it was just reiterating that this is what, when you talk about DEI, it's not a particular group, it involves everyone and it touches every part of your organization. So, there was nothing new or nothing to sort of halt or stop doing, but rather just embracing and giving an opportunity to help inform more stakeholders about what DEI was, and dispel the rumor about what it was not.
Thank you. Malika, what is the DEI lens at Morgan Lewis?
I can't agree more with Manya. I think there is, especially externally or outside of the legal industry, there is what DEI means in an academic setting is very different from what it means here. And we are all really focused on making sure that we create a platform where people can build a practice, and that we are in a working environment that we continue to be the employer of choice because we understand how to be inclusive, how to be collaborative, and people can develop professionally within the organization. And I think that ultimately that goes to a lot of what Caren and Manya were saying in terms of systems. But then again, there's also opportunities to the extent your firms have a labor and employment practice. And we have a large one, and there was a DEI task force that was created that was really able to kind of energize those that are passionate and those that have expertise. And I think that in diversity and inclusion, or equity and inclusion, there is a sense sometimes that people find their purpose or are passionate about this space because they particularly may have experience in it. And so you find yourself raising your hand to participate and do things that would be what we call kind of, the culture work of your organization. And sometimes that's not given necessarily credit that looks like professional development or business development, the things that for our lawyers in particular help them build a practice. And so when we have something like a DEI task force, it allows for people to marry that passion alongside their practice, right? And so we are advising clients on the results and what it means for employers. We're putting together teams that are both, of our practicing attorneys and professionals around crisis management, litigation, et cetera, and labor and employment practices. But while that work is fantastic, of course, for our clients, and we are supportive in that realm, we're also giving folks here internally a platform to build upon, right? How does this, how do these decisions relate to their practice? What are the things that they are very interested in? How can you take that passion into helping you build that practice and continuing your professional development? In the same vein, I think for instance, our billable hours credit for diversity and inclusion related activities is in the same line, right? We value our commitment to creating inclusive spaces, to making sure that we recruit from places and being in touch with everyone. And that includes those that may be underrepresented in the law schools, for instance, or for our lateral markets. But in the end, what we want to make sure that we're doing is giving people the opportunity to, see us as an employer of choice, to be able to practice here, and anything that you do in order to benefit that is also part of our D&I billable credit. So we're giving credit for the work that we value, the firm's efforts in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that's available to everyone. So it's not just simply in the hands of those who are passionate. It's not just simply in the hands of those that find themselves kind of navigating firms as someone who's underrepresented. It's the responsibility and the commitment of everyone, and your systems and your incentives need to be aligned with that. And so I think that after the decisions, we were really happy that we had these things in place because it allows for people to be proactive and be responsive to the moment without having to leave their professional development to the side.
That is extraordinary, Malika. And it really speaks to Caren's point on creating that access when you can give credit for the DEIB initiatives and also really integrate it into the culture of the entire firm. Can you give us any specific examples of how people are taking advantage of that billable credit for DEIB initiatives?
Yeah. So we have, for instance, we have lawyer networks that are, which are a little bit different from affinity groups. Affinity groups are from the perspective of I and are typically closed to that demographic. We have lawyer networks, which are really, we center the experiences of whatever the demographic is of that lawyer network. And so we give, for instance, billable hour credit for being proactive and helping further the firm's commitment in the space of inclusion and diversity and equity. And so that means, you know, raising your hand to volunteer to facilitate a discussion, to participate in some of our workshops as a facilitator, as opposed to just an attendee, and going through the process in order to be a facilitator. So taking the time to be one of the educators at the firm internally is one of the ways. And of course, again, we're thinking about development when it comes to that, to be putting together any of our student affinity group related activities that we do on the campuses from the law schools that we recruit from. How do we give thought leadership and how we call it kind of gifts to the industry, which is we are here to just create more transparency around what the private practice of law looks like. And when you raise your hand to participate in that, to help further those commitments, that's what the billable hour credit is for. So it's not being a passive participant, but really being active. And I think that sometimes folks, you know, might misconstrue the practice of being inclusive, the practice of being able to lead talent across the spectrum, the practice of equity, being able to identify spaces in which you can provide support that is specific to the individual, that would allow for them to thrive. Not everybody needs the same support. Being able to do that does not require you yourself to be underrepresented. And that is what we hope to kind of get across and what we are doing. We want to build leaders in this space that are able to do that. And that is a skill set. And so I think that sometimes we get caught up in the rhetoric of DEI as being an ideology, when in fact, this is a business strategy. It is a talent development strategy that folks who really kind of know how to utilize it, I think really benefit from, and in particular, our clients benefit the most.
So true. I want to come back to that, but I want to bring Cheryl into the conversation. Cheryl, you had shared some really interesting ideas about the opportunities that opened up at Ulrich when the diversity lens was kind of put in the spotlight.
Yeah, so I think, we were, like many others on this call, we weren't surprised by the decisions that were coming and the composition of the court. And we actually had a pretty close follow on this because we were working on some of the amicus briefs associated with the Supreme Court case. So when it came down, we weren't particularly surprised. And I think we were in the same boat as many others, is that we didn't have to make a lot of changes, though, because we always had been thinking about diversity broadly. And I think, as others have said on this call already, this is a business imperative as well as just a thing that we should do regardless. It works with our business and it works for us, is the right thing to do overall. And we view this through the lens of broadly defined diversity leads to a variety of backgrounds and experiences that help enrich the firm and help us better serve our clients. And it's always been our mindset of trying to train, mentor, sponsor all of our team members to make sure every single person who comes in the doors of this firm is successful and meeting the needs of all of those folks, regardless and in celebration of every background and every different experience that comes into the firm. So I think we really look at diversity and have before and continue to look at diversity of the pool of candidates that we're dealing with before they come in the door and while they're here, and supporting that pool as a whole. So if we start with a group of diverse folks, we support all of those folks, what they need individually, then we have success across that group. And we're able to see everyone move forward and everyone succeed. And I think, particularly with the focus on the Supreme Court decision, and I think we didn't see any pullback, and our commitment never wavered. And I think we've really always operated around two core principles in this space, that bringing together diverse perspectives allows us to give the best legal advice that's necessary to giving the best legal advice. And our priority as a firm is to have an inclusive culture. And that's what we're continually trying to foster day to day through all the programs that we support. I think one thing that certainly did happen, though, is there's always been discussion in this space. And it's one of the great things about the DEI community is I feel like there's a lot of dialogue that's always been going on. But this actually even brought increased focus and brought even a better, richer dialogue to what was already going on and bringing more people into the conversation. And we're really fortunate to have, we have a couple of what we call advisory boards that are composed of some of our clients that we use to talk about supporting and advancing women, diverse candidates, addition to women, and across innovation even. We have advisory boards that work with us, and they're sounding boards for us, and they're checks on what are we doing, what's the industry doing, how are we making sure we're meeting everyone's needs in the ways that we should be. And so we had this forum that already existed that we were able to leverage to have even more discussions, have richer discussions, and talk about how as a community we're thinking about these issues, addressing them, benchmarking our efforts against one another. And this just became one more point in that discussion, but I do actually think it almost brought a renewed focus, that it renewed, this is important, let's talk about this even more than we already were. And so I think that's some of what we saw based on what was in place. And similar to other firms on this call, we do advising work as well for our clients in this space and have a resource center set up. So we're looking at from our own perspective, but then also advising clients on DEI strategies and compliance focused on mitigating legal risk, but while the whole time advancing DEI in the workplace. And so just that compliance piece that we've all talked about and continuing to move these programs forward in an unwavering way.
It's like this opportunity where those who didn't understand it or weren't sure about it or questioned it had this new opportunity to gain exposure to the DEIB within their organizations, within their law firm, and to learn more about it. I learned long ago this expression, if you want to really learn something, teach it. And I hear that in what Malika was talking about. Monia, I saw you nodding along. What is WilmerHale doing in terms of, as we roll into 24, the initiatives that are front and center for you?
I think one of our most impactful initiatives that's really baked into the culture is our work assignment process. We have a practice management team, and we have a centralized staffing process. So and it really goes to show, we can hope and believe in sort of the meritocracy of law firms, and the cream will naturally rise to the top. But that's not the way that it happens. And when you have we have a practice management team that is focused on the development and advancement of all of the attorneys within the practice group and within that department. So that means there is intentionality from the time, from our summer associate program, but from the time a fall associate starts around what opportunities that they're giving. And that group meets regularly with the DEI team, the department chairs, the practice group leaders, and our legal personnel. So you have this umbrella of intentionality around what opportunities there are. And that's how you make sure that you get the representation, both in terms of diversity, just in terms of the wide range of diversity, but in terms of the opportunities that Caren talked about, when she talked about for example, our IP department and the women leaders, and 3 of our 5 departments are led by women. The percentage of our highest gross, the percentage is like 30% of our most highly compensated partners are women. And when you have that intentionality and you're constantly building leadership, you're building a pipeline and it feeds on. So I think that's one of the things that really stands out in terms of what we're doing and what's been working well. And we share that model with clients. As that's really important. When Cheryl talked about this sort of now community of having these conversations more regularly and sharing practices and realizing that we're in it together. I think it started sort of an offshoot of the survey process when we were all like, stop asking us for our data and then letting it sit on a shelf and then we don't talk to you anymore. So over the course of the last couple of years, we started having more engagement from that perspective. And then I think we're just building on that in this arena. So now we're talking about succession planning and having these calls more quarterly. And what are you doing to advance your women in leadership? And how are you structuring your professional development programs? And to Caren's point, we all are recognizing that in terms of inclusiveness around our attorneys with disability, what are you doing in that space? What are some of the best practices? So I think that those an offshoot of this kind of new norm that we're in is everyone realizes that we're in it together. And at the end of the day, it is a business imperative. As much as we all are invested and we know and think that it's the right thing to do for a host of reasons, we know that the bottom line is that it's a really important business imperative, and that's why we all have to continue to stay engaged.
CHIPS launched a general counsel boot camp a year ago. We're in cohort 2 now, and in cohort 1 we had 8 of the women who were promoted into new roles or new positions entirely at new companies. And it really is this partnership, right? Of here are the women who are signaling to the world, we're ready to advance in our careers. We're taking this opportunity. We're doing all the work. How do we partner together now? How do we work with our law firms? How do we find those opportunities? And it is this collaboration. It's just so fantastic. Stacy, talk to us about what you're doing, how you're directing your efforts, and also this relationship with clients and what they're looking for in that partnership with you.
Absolutely. I mean, and I just want to take a step back and say, as I listen to the other panelists and think about what it might be to be an attendee who doesn't have the same level of infrastructure or buy-in that we all do, I don't want to say blessed, because it is a lot of hard work and a lot of effort to get buy-in and collaboration from our stakeholders. But, we have systems in place. They might have different names. They might have different agendas, but we also have strategic services around this for our clients, and we have diversity billable hour credit, and we have workflow applications and processes, but that's not built in a day. And so for those people who don't have all that, just start thinking about this. At least this is my own Stacy Collier personal opinion. It's about communication and culture, and everything else will fall into place. It's having success around 1 or 2 of these initiatives or processes, and then the rest builds on it. So I was just thinking, this is great. I'm like, oh, thank God we have that too. But then I thought, oh, how would I feel if I was somebody that didn't have, 80% of what these panelists are talking about? Is it hopeless? It's not. But it is around, creating the communication and the culture to build the right infrastructure around this so that you can get to where you want and need to go. And clients are a huge piece of that, because I think what's been incredibly helpful in continuing the conversation at my firm, and I'm sure with my colleagues on the panel as well, has been, I have not seen a foot off the gas with clients, right? Our clients are still looking for the data. And I think it was Manya who was talking about, you know, they're not just looking for survey responses, they're actively engaged with us about what the meaning of those survey responses are. A shout out to Diversity Lab and the Dividends Collective program, and really thinking about how to manage that data in a way that moves us forward in the DEI space. So, you know, it is extremely helpful when we can say that our clients are still super engaged on this, making decisions around hiring and expanding the work that they do with our firm based on what they're seeing in terms of the teams that we're presenting, and the level of involvement that our underrepresented lawyers are having on the work that they're doing for these clients, the incredible skills that those lawyers bring to the table, and just really thinking about how they're working with us in a really intentional and deliberate way. I had a phenomenal experience this week when I had something of a naysayer, or at least a skeptic, let's say a DEI skeptic, who is, you know, asks a lot of questions, and I love questions, even if they demonstrate that maybe that person doesn't have the same belief system as I do. At least they're asking questions and they're looking to get educated. And that same person this week brought me into pitch because they needed a team with underrepresented lawyers, and my team has that, right? And so I was like, I bet you I'm not going to get the same type of questions the next time we do a program or we have something that we're looking to do in the DEI space. And so, you know, the client engagement, communication, activism on this has been critical in continuing to move DEI forward.
I love that, Stacy. Every opportunity is an opportunity to gain exposure and awareness and build that foundation of trust, really. Caren, I'd love to bring you into the conversation. You have this privilege of seeing all the data from all the 300 plus firms. And I would love to hear what one, like Stacy said, it can be a little overwhelming to hear these 4 firms thriving and doing all the stuff, right? What is there one thing you would tell law firms and legal departments to focus on to start to level the playing field for all talent?
Definitely. And so when I say what I'm about to say, I want to harken back to something Stacy said. You know, when Monya and Malika and Cheryl and Stacy talk about systems, sometimes we're talking about, you know, resources and systems where we're tracking and documenting, and maybe it's an app or maybe it's a tech, you know, based tool. But in a lot of instances, what we're talking about, these 4 firms, but a lot of firms that are participating in the Inclusion Blueprint, just harkens back to communications. So it's Daniel Kahneman's slow thinking, fast thinking. So if a firm doesn't have a ton of resources to do these things, but they just created an intentionality, Monya says that a lot, and I love it. If we just backed up and had intentionality around these communications, that enough would be a great starting point. So if, for instance, we met with our practice group leaders, and as part of a regular agenda, it was, are we making sure that all of our talent has equal opportunity to have direct and regular interaction with clients? And if not, what are we doing? And that might be as easy as, you know, if you're in the labor and employment group and you have a roster of 20 lawyers or 10 lawyers, just quickly looking at that list every month and saying, what are each of these people doing? And are they getting the type of work that's going to advance their career? So when we're talking about systems, sometimes that's what we mean is just stop, reflect, look at the humans in the group and ask yourself, so they're getting equal access to business development, to work allocation. So Monica, that's how I would answer your question, is just start with what Stacy said, which is communication with your practice group and your other leaders. And then the second thing is intentionality around stopping, reflecting, and asking those questions. And then it may lead to challenges that need bigger system interventions where, you know, like we work with Stacy and Nixon on something that we call inclusive team building, so that we just ask the partners every time you're staffing a case, stop, don't just go to the people you always go to. And instead consider at least 30% people who don't look like you. And we're not telling you to staff your cases in a particular way. We're just asking you to stop and reflect on who you're putting on your teams and making sure that you're picking people who you're helping to advance their careers, and you're making sure that they benefit the client and the team that they're working with. And so that's what I would suggest, is that it doesn't have to be complex. In fact, behavioral science tells us that simplicity, both in actions and in communications, actually tends to move the needle more than all of these like really complex things we try to put in place that have excitement and hubbub at the beginning, but then fail because they're really hard to maintain.
I hear
Well,
you so much, Caren.
I just wanted to say something in response to Caren, which is, it's the whole reason we have the TLDR caveat at the beginning of lengthy emails. It's like nobody, if it's going to take a lot of effort to digest it, people put it on the back burner. So I love the suggestion of simplicity and straightforwardness in communication, because I think you're just going to get a far broader group of stakeholders.
Yeah, I agree. And I love the focus here on mindfulness, which is really what we're all talking about, right? We can't have success in DEIB without wellness, because then what we see is reaction instead of, like Caren said, the pause. And when we get the pause, then we get, like what Stacy was talking about, the curiosity. What do clients want? Let me be curious about this, instead of the judgment, right? And because when we react, it's a source of judgment. But when we can pause, we can maybe say like, oh, who's not here? Who should I be talking to? What are all of you seeing in terms of partnerships with clients? What are the clients wanting? And how is that reflective in your recruiting practices? Stacy, you want to talk to us about that?
You're not sick of me? Yeah, I mean, I think our clients really, I think our clients obviously want superb legal talent, but I also think that there is a push towards the whole person as well, right? And so, you know, people who are interesting and have diverse backgrounds and ways in which they approach things, and all the reasons why we know that diverse teams create much more innovative results. But I think our clients want that as well. They don't want a team of robots who, leaving AI aside, you know, I know that's another panel in and of itself, but, you know, they want human beings. And so, you know, thinking about that in approaching our recruiting, right? Like, it's not just about pedigree. It's not a pedigree game. It's about broadening the schools from which we recruit. It's about thinking about, you know, whether a summer program is appropriate for every market in our firm, or whether we're better served by working with school year interns and having more time and space with them and giving them more opportunities to get feedback and interactions with colleagues. And so, you know, just being creative in terms of how and where we're recruiting and how we're onboarding people.
Well, if I could jump in on this, that's been a big focus for work. And I think, Caren, what you said about intentionality and stopping and focusing, and that's one place where we, I think, did that and have made some changes in terms of how we think about the talent pool we're starting with, and then how we think about folks we want to hire. And then once we get there, what do we do with them and how do we support them? And one of the things we've done recently is started working with Legal Innovators, which, for folks in the call who don't know who they are, it's a startup company that's specifically focused on disrupting the way in which new lawyers come into big law. So instead of taking the traditional top 14 model, which many firms have used for many years, is looking beyond that. And they focus on quality talent, and there are top 14 schools in their pool, but there are also historically Black universities and colleges. There are geographically diverse schools that aren't typically touched by the top 14. So they start with a much broader pool of candidates to be able to look at data across the students there. And I think it will be no surprise to everyone that there isn't a great correlation necessarily between where you went to law school and how you succeed as a lawyer long-term. You see people from excellent schools perhaps not do as well, and you see people from number 15 school, number whatever school, do really, really well. And I think what Legal Innovators is doing is looking at all of those other criteria beyond academic excellence that go into being a good lawyer. This is ultimately a client service industry, so there are a lot of non-academic skills that people who may be incredibly book smart don't necessarily have. And we can find through other data and metrics and pulling in that much broader group of candidates to start with. So when we're looking to hire folks in, we are starting with a much broader, much more diverse pool to begin with. But then the question is, what do you do with those folks once you have them? And so I think the continued intentionality is there. And someone was talking about this earlier, and I apologize for not recalling who, but the individual focus is really important, of looking at each of those people as an individual and how do we support them through their career. And one of the things we've done at ORIC recently is rethought our first year model. Our chief talent officer here, Siobhan Hanley, who's amazing, came up with this idea of the residency program. And it's conceptualized after the medical residency idea, where the focus is not just throwing first year associates into billable work and having that be their pure focus. In addition to that, there's some of that, but it's also focused on thought leadership, learning the client's businesses, coaching, curated development experiences, and letting them get to know and understand the clients. Because I think to what Stacy was saying earlier, in terms of what clients care about, one of the things they care about is people understanding their business. And the more we can help our lawyers from day one understand our client's business, the more valuable they are to us, the more valuable they are to the clients, the more likely they are to succeed. And this model really gives us a different way of looking at how we train our lawyers, and not just throwing them into the deep end of, bill 1,900 hours this year, and that's all we care about, but developing them as whole lawyers from the beginning and starting with that broader, more diverse pool, giving them all access to this opportunity to really get to know the client's business and understand how to serve those clients better. We hope we will see, and we are starting to see already, increased success there of everyone from class coming up together, being successful together, and being able to support all those folks together. And we start with a more diverse pool than, folks coming out of law school are more diverse than the attorneys in our firm overall. Typically, our classes that we begin with are the most diverse. So the more we can keep and hold on to all of those people, the more diverse we have, the greater trajectory we have for continued diversity year over year over year over year. So that's how we've been thinking about it. And I think, Stacey, it goes along a lot with what you were saying.
What are some of those retention practices or engagement practices that are working?
So again, I think it really goes back to individualized attention, and it's not a one size fits all model. And I think that's the thing we've learned over time is the more high touch, the more individualized, the better it works. And that's the client partnerships we have with our diverse attorneys that are most successful as well, is the places where people are very actively engaged. And it's not just everyone's going to hear the same speech and take away what you will and go off and do it, but rather one-on-one coaching, individualized feedback. We've done some work with clients like Genentech, where we have our clients meeting with certain of our attorneys and giving them feedback, telling them about their business so they can learn about how it operates, understanding what matters when they're buying legal services so they understand how to do client service better. Though not a client, we partner with Diversity Lab on initiatives too, to get our lawyers, and particularly our partner level folks. It's the Focused 5 program that I'm sure that Caren could speak to even more, but having historically underrepresented org partners work with business development coaches and in-house sponsors to learn a better business development approach and grow their networks. And again, it's that individualized, one-on-one, curated experience that's really the most successful. The broad-based, across the board kind of training stuff, it doesn't really work. You need to really figure out how to help people individually for every lawyer.
That's fantastic. Manya, what's standing out for you, and what are your priorities for talent recruitment and engagement for the year?
Yeah, I think Cheryl hit on a lot of important points. We talk about data a lot, and we talk about metrics, and we know it's really important because it's how we sort of gauge and how we get the lay of the land. But, one of the things that I think can get lost is how important, equally important, qualitative data is. The data will tell some of the story, but there's another part of the story, and it's really important to Cheryl's point, when you talk about the individualization of these processes and the coaching. We don't have to always guess about why we aren't retaining people at the level that we want to retain. People tell us, what's working, what's not working, how they feel. And one of the things that I think is really important for law firms and legal departments to do is listen to what people are telling you when they're telling you how they feel. And going back to the systems, the overall systems theme of having in place, I think it's really important to have a structure in place where that qualitative data can get fed up to leadership and to people who are department chairs and leading the firm, and they get a sense of having their ear to the ground and understanding not just what the numbers and what the metrics say, but how are people feeling, how are people engaged. And that's a big part of what I think, DEI teams and legal personnel teams, and I think that's the value. We look at the quantitative data, and that's really important, but the qualitative data that's like the royal jelly. And I think a lot of times that gets underestimated. And going back to the skill set that Malika talked about, it's not going to, you're not going to have people just come and sit down and tell you, this is how I'm feeling. I feel isolated, or I'm wondering if I'm getting the same opportunity. So it comes back full circle about going on, having the opportunity in this current climate to engage many stakeholders, but also recognizing the skill set that comes with building an inclusive environment and learning how to listen to people, and then learning how to share that information and incorporate that into your strategic planning and systems oriented. And I think that's something that's the really key point of bringing it all together in terms of the quantitative data, the qualitative data, and partnering with our clients.
That's fantastic, Manya. Do you have formal processes for sponsorship, mentorship, allyship, and even I'm hearing this connection between not just within WilmerHale, but also within the clients, this really partnership and leverage?
We have a number of partnerships with some of our clients around professional development and engagement with them. In terms of internally, we don't have a formal sponsorship program, but going back to what I was talking about in terms of that qualitative data, we have a number of systems in place where I or members of my team meet regularly with practice group leaders, department chairs, and we go through our entire roster of attorneys, and particularly making sure that when we have attorneys that are we want to make sure that they know that they are valued and that they're getting the opportunities, and are they happy? Are there things that they want? There are channels in place that allow us to focus around that development. So it includes the department chairs and leaders, but then going back to the model of our work assignment and working with practice management. So it's not a formalized sort of this is a sponsorship program, but it has all of the tools and everything that you want to have in place to allow people to advance in the highest way that they want to, and that they're interested in advancing their careers.
That personal approach is so fantastic. Malika, tell us about what you're doing.
It's so funny. It's as I was listening to everyone speaking, I thought to myself, ultimately, we also want to make sure that our client service is in line with who our clients are. And when we think about who runs legal departments, who are in the legal operations space, a lot of these folks are folks who've come through private practice, have decided to go in-house. And the law firm and the legal departments are as diverse as they've ever been, right? And so how are we thinking about excellent client service beyond, of course, excellent, legal advice, et cetera, excellent quality of work needs to be there. I think that's a given, especially across the firms represented here today. But then beyond that, how do we make the connections? How do we build that network? I think that there's a generation of people who learned how to play golf as a result of building relationships with clients. There's a generation of people who had to be into sports generally in order to make connections, bids of connections with their clients. I don't think this stuff is hard or rocket science. It really, inclusive practices, understanding that we have diverse perspectives in the room, that regardless of whether you appear to be underrepresented or not, the challenges of having an experience that isn't obviously in the majority, whatever that may be, may touch us all. And so how do we connect to someone where they get to show up as their full selves without really being skilled in signaling to our clients, signaling to the people that we have under, who are here to follow us, we have a leadership role over. How do we signal to them that they can show up? And the way that we do that is being educated, having cultural competency, understanding that everybody's experience is the same, understanding challenges that folks may have depending on their demographics, and just being mindful of it. We don't have to be experts, but how do we signal that this is a place that our representation will take you into account? And the only way to kind of give an individualized kind of set of tools or set of resources is for us to be educated in this way. And I think there's all kinds of things. There's systems that can incentivize that behavior. There's trainings that can where people can share. Lots of us have employee resource groups or affinity groups where people come together to share those experiences. How do you leverage the experience of those that come together to educate the firm generally? Because ultimately that education allows for folks who are in direct contact with our clients to be mindful of that and to connect to them in that way as well. And so part of, again, all of this, I think, thinking about the ways in which we do this, we really do see this as part of a talent development and business strategy, because we want to make sure we're making those connections. We want our teams to make sure that they understand that this is how we can make those connections. And so it's just great to hear all of the things that my peers and the other firms are doing, because it allows for us, it just tells me so much about how we've evolved and how we've brought in ways to make connections and to build relationships and fulsome relationships, because this work is hard. It consumes a lot of our time, and it's great that we're at a place and time where if it's going to take up this much space in our lives, that we can bring our whole selves to it.
Malika, you're speaking to my heart. This is the driving force of CHIPS and why we are here and why we keep showing up to create these spaces for women to advance across the ecosystem. Caren, I want to turn to you for some final remarks, and I would love to hear what Diversity Lab is most excited for this year. Is there something that's driving your work? And please check out the chat for our future dates before you go.
We're working on a lot, so I'll skip that piece and answer your question. And Malika, I got so inspired as you were speaking, and I wrote down a sentence that you said that I think, and this goes back to something Manya said at the very top of the call, and Stacy and Cheryl, you echoed this. DEI is not about set-asides or quotas or a particular race or a particular gender. I'm going to shorten it a little bit, Malika, but what I heard you say is DEI is leveraging and fully supporting our entire workforce to service our clients. And when I think about the people who are doing this work, they start with, we need to service our clients. We need to reflect our clients. We need to service our clients. And we want to benefit from our entire workforce. But if right now we're not benefiting and fully leveraging our entire workforce, then we're only giving half of our great people to our clients. So that's what I would say about all the work that we're doing. And I think 3 themes came out of today. One is intentionality and individuality. Second is communications. It doesn't matter what you're doing. If you're not communicating or you're not thinking about the stepping back and reflecting on communicating what should and shouldn't be happening in your organization. And then the third and final thing I keep hearing is, this is about our clients. This is about making sure that our talent is fully prepared to service our clients. And anybody that's working in this space that doesn't have clients as at least half of their focus, I think is missing out on what we're trying to do as law firms and as legal departments. So Cheryl, Monia, Stacy, and Malika, I just think that Ulrich and Nixon and Wilmer Hale and Morgan Lewis could not be luckier to have talent such as you leading these areas of focus. And CHIPS, Wow. Without your partnership, we wouldn't have thousands of people focused on this in the way we do, especially in the IP realm.
Thank you all. That was just fantastic. I couldn't agree more, Caren. Thank you all so much, Stacy, Malika, Manya, and Cheryl, and Caren. We love our partnership with Diversity Lab. We have some more DEIB events coming up in the series, so please check out the chat, put them on your calendar, save the date, and we can't wait to see you all again really soon. Have an incredible day.
Thank you.
Well done, everybody.